Thanks, Chloe. So this event is going to start with a reading of the two short poems. Following the reading, Professor Wise will speak on the two poems and what they reveal about the current Palestinian-Israeli conflict. Following the lecture, there'll be time for questions. We acknowledge that the important issues discussed today are sensitive topics for many people. Today's talk is intended to be educational. As we are students at the start of a career that is in many ways linked to our professionalism, out of respect for each other, there will be a zero tolerance policy for any form of discrimination or harassment at today's event. Everyone is entitled to be treated with respect and free of conduct that is offensive, hostile, intimidating, or inconsistent with their personal dignity and rights. We hope that you will respect this decision and approach today's discussion with an open mind. I see there's a lot of people who just arrived. Feel free to help yourself with food. And Chloe, can you deliver poems to them? Oh, no. So a little bit about today's speaker. Christopher Wise is a professor of English and comparative literature. He has taught at Western Washington University since 1996. Professor Wise teaches world literatures, including African, Middle Eastern, and European literatures. His research interests include the African Sahel, the Middle East, France, and former Francophone colonies. He also writes translations, nonfiction critical theory, and philosophy. A four-time Fulbright scholar, Professor Wise has lectured in universities and embassies throughout Africa and the Middle East. From 2001 to 2003, Professor Wise taught at the University of Jordan, Amman, developing programs in American Studies and Islamic Studies. Prior to that, he taught on a Fulbright Award at the University of Ouagadougou in Burkina Faso from 1996 to 1997. Recent books include À la recherche de Yambo Walagam, Sorcery, Totem, and Jihad in African Philosophy, Archives of the Umerian Tijaniya, and In Search of Yambo Walagam. In addition to his books, Wise has translated many books and authored numerous articles on African, the Middle Eastern, and other global literatures during his career. Professor Wise is originally from Oklahoma and is a citizen of the Muskogee Nation. Now we'll welcome Chloe to read the first poem.
The first poem, I think everyone has a copy. It's called I Talk Too Much by Mahmud, Darwish. I talk too much about the slightest nuance between women and trees. I talk about the earth's enchantment, about a country with no passport stamp. I ask, is it true, good ladies and gentlemen, that the earth of man is for all human beings? As you say, in that case, where is my little cottage and where am I? The conference audience applauded me for 3 more minutes. 3 minutes of freedom and recognition. The conference approves of our right of return, like all chickens and horses, to a dream made of stone. I shake hands with them, one by one. I bow to them, then I continue my journey to another country and talk about the differences between a mirage and the rain. I ask, is it true, good ladies and gentlemen, that the earth of man is for all human beings?
Thank you. Now Kaylee will read the second poem.
Jews in the Land of Israel by Yehuda Amichai. We forget where we came from. Our Jewish names from the exile give us the head. Bring back the memory of flower and fruit, medieval cities, metals, knights who turn to stone, roses, spices whose scent drift away, precious stones, lots of bread, handicrafts long gone from the world. The hands are gone too. Circumcision does it to us, as in the Bible's story of Shechem and the sons of Jacob, so that we go on hurting all our lives. What are we doing coming back here with this pain? Our longings were drained together with the swamps. The desert blooms for us, and our children are beautiful. Even the wrecks of ships that sank on the way reached the shore. Even winds did, not all the sails. What are we doing in this dark land with its yellow shadows that pierce the eyes? Every now and then, someone says, even after 40 or 50 years, the sun is killing. What are we doing with these souls of mist, with these names, with our eyes of forest, with our beautiful children, with our quick blood? Spilled blood is not the roots of trees, but it's the closest thing to roots we have.
Thank you. Now we will turn it over to Professor Wise.
Okay, thank you very much for that introduction and for reading the poems. We've got about an hour, and I want to leave time for discussion as well. So we probably won't be able to do justice fully to these poems because they're very complex poems, and we can only touch on some major themes here, especially if we're going to leave time for discussion. And we're going to zero in on this question, as you saw in the advertisement for the event, the question of the right of return versus the question of the law of return. And I'm assuming here, my assumption is that many of you don't read or study poetry that much, or I know you're busy law students, and so I don't want to make too many assumptions about the knowledge that you're bringing to the discussion of poetry. Also, I'm not making any assumptions about knowledge of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, and so for some of you, the material that we'll discuss may be review. For others, it may be brand new, but again, the assumption is that you don't know this material. So in the case of a few remarks then, one thing to note, I did not choose these poets randomly. Mahmud Darwish is the Palestinian national poet. He's buried in Ramallah in the West Bank, and was a very beloved figure, and was the national conscience and voice of the Palestinians. And this is, for me, as someone who teaches poetry, underscores the importance of poetry itself to nationalism. This is a translation from the Arabic. In the case of the Yehuda Amichai poem, this is also translated from the Hebrew, in this case from the modern Hebrew. He also is a major figure in Israeli poetry and literature and politics. And he wrote this in a language that at that time didn't really even exist. It was something that Israelis like Amichai willed into being. And so he is the sort of first major modern, first major poet of modern Hebrew. Okay. And in the case of his poem, we want to focus on the law of return. In the case of Darwish, we want to focus on the question of the right of return. Okay. So again, I'm going to try to be brief here because of the time we have. First thing to note, I had the good fortune of seeing Mahmud Darwish in Atlanta, Georgia, a number of years ago. And this was in the mid-90s. He's since passed away, and he did what we can't conflate necessarily the I that's speaking in the poem with Darwish himself. But if it's not Darwish, it's somebody who's a lot like him, somebody who goes around to conferences and does talks, lectures, reads his poetry, as Darwish often did. But you can see the sort of the weary tone that he has in the poem of going to these different conferences and repeating the same message over and over again. And then effectively nothing really changes for him or for the Palestinians. Okay, now I would draw your attention to the theme of the poem, which is expressed in the form of a question. Is it a rhetorical question? Is it actually a thesis? That's something that you can ponder. But the question is it true, good ladies and gentlemen, that the earth of man is for all human beings? This is repeated twice, okay? And again, if you're studying poetry, you'll know that repetition is important. So this is a major question. And what Darwish is really talking about here is cosmopolitan right, okay? So as students of law, you are probably familiar with Kant's idea of the cosmopolitan right, that basically is based on the notion that the earth is essentially a big round ball, and everybody has to put their feet somewhere on the planet. And this is, from this develops the liberal democratic concept of the citizen, which is the citizen as in the liberal Enlightenment concept of the citizen, from the French cité, as in a city or resident. So this is the concept of the human subject and the idea of human rights, the cosmopolitan right, the right of hospitality, to share the surface of the earth, that everybody has that right. And so your rights are, in this case, are not based on your ethnicity, they're not based on your race, they're not based on your gender, your religion, et cetera, et cetera. They're simply based on where you're on your 2 feet, the idea of where you reside on the planet. Now, he speaks then, if we go down further into the poem, after he asks this question, he says, the conference approves our right of return. This is the context you have to understand what he's really saying here as he asserts this idea of cosmopolitan right. And I'm going to show you some images here of photographs that I took in Palestine that may help to illustrate this for you. Okay, so this is the work of Banksy outside of Bethlehem on the wall. So the racial segregation wall that's been constructed in Israel. But I wanted to show you a few things to bear in mind. Okay, so here, as you can see, is a map of Israel in 1946 and Palestine in 46 versus today. And you can see there the steady encroachment of Israeli settlements, so that the population of the Palestinians has radically dwindled. Okay, now I showed you this image earlier. The Nakba is a word that means catastrophe, and there were two major catastrophes. There have been more, but the ones that are usually referred to with this expression Nakba are in 1947 through 49, when you had at least 750,000 Palestinians of the total population of 1.9 million at that time who became refugees. And then in 1967, in the Six-Day War, when another 200,000 Palestinians became displaced. And so if we go back to this map now, you can see the dots on the map. These are refugee camps. And you can see there's some in Lebanon, some in Syria, some in Jordan, some in West Bank, some in Gaza, etc. And these are the places where the people who experienced the Nakba or the catastrophe went in the aftermath of these events, which were again catastrophic for the Palestinians, and largely because they were not allowed to return to their homes. And this gets us to the question of right of return. The expulsion, one is expelled from one's house and one is not allowed to return to one's home. Okay, this is Article 13. I've made a copy of this, of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Again, remember the UN, the concept of the human subject in the UN is Kantian. It was originally the Kantian League that became the League of Nations, that became the UN. And so the philosophy of Kant is very important to the establishment of international law, or the articulation of international law in the Declaration of Human Rights. Now, according to Article 13, everyone has the right to freedom of movement and residence within the borders of each state. And everyone has the right to leave any country, including his own, and to return to his country. Okay, so the fundamental question then that Darwish is asking in this is it really true that the surface of the earth is for all people to share, as is articulated, for instance, in the UN Charter? Is it really true that I have the right of return to my homeland? Okay, so for instance, I live here in Bellingham. You're in Washington. You're in Tucson. You're right close to the border of Mexico. I'm close to the border of Canada. So if I go to Canada for the weekend, I cannot be stopped at the border. I have the right to return to my own home. And this is the right that he is asserting when he claims that the Palestinians says that the Palestinians don't have this right of return. Okay, so I'm going to show you a few more illustrations here, keeping cognizant of the time, so we can have time for questions. Here's a copy of Darwish's identity card. Now, his most famous poem is entitled Identity Card, and it's effectively the Palestinian national poem. He also wrote the Constitution as well, but for the Palestinians. But here you can see this is in a museum in Ramallah dedicated to Darwish, and it's a symbol of the ambiguous place of the Palestinians. Like, is Palestine a sovereign state or not? Is it let's say, a reservation under the control of the Palestinian Authority who rule on behalf of the Israelis, much like the reservation system here in the United States? Sovereignty, this question of sovereignty is in question for Mahmud Darwish, and the identity card and the difficulty of traveling without a passport draw attention to this fact. Okay, I'm going to go. Let me read this for you now first. Well, this is a cartoon that I got out of a journal in Jordan. This is the former Jerusalem Star that later became the Jordan Star. But this, I think, illustrates this sentiment that we find articulated in Darwish's poem. You can see there at the top of the cartoon, you have a man who says, "I'm Ellie Bronstein from the Bronx, and Jerusalem belongs to me. I'm Nathan Jablonski, and Jerusalem belongs to me. I'm Sarah Felucia from Ethiopia. Jerusalem belongs to me. I'm Jacob Cohen from the Amazon, and it belongs to me," et cetera, et cetera. And then you see Mohammed Salam down there at the bottom. He says, "I am Mohammed Salam from Jerusalem, and I guess I must have been confused all this time." Okay, so we'll come back to this question of the law of return and what it is that for the Israelis there is this one can migrate to Israel on this basis. But I wanted to show you first, this is a picture that I took in Bethlehem, and you can see there, this is a refugee camp, Palestinian refugee camp, not far from the wall that Banksy painted in the previous image. And there you can see at the top a key. And many Palestinians at refugee camps hold on to their keys because this is a symbol, this has become a symbol of one's right to return and desire to return, and not giving up on this universal human right that belongs to all people, except, as Darwish is saying here, seemingly the Palestinians. We will return. This is taken from graffiti not far from there. Here you can see another image of a Palestinian saying, "Resist to exist." This is again Bethlehem. We will win. And then here I wanted to show you this image. This is in Ramallah, not far from the museum of Mahmud Darwish, and also the mausoleum of Yasser Arafat. And this figure is, of course, Nelson Mandela. So what is Nelson Mandela? What is a statue of Nelson Mandela doing in Ramallah? It's an interesting question. Well, you know, Edward Said, who wrote Orientalism, Question of Palestine, a famous advocate for Palestinian rights, who was Palestinian himself, he repeated the mantra of Mandela, which, Mandela went to prison for 30 years in apartheid South Africa simply because he repeated this mantra, one person, one vote. And this is the mantra that also someone like Said reiterated, based on the idea that if one were to give each person one vote in a fair society in which each person had a similar status within that society, then you'd have a real sort of demographic problem for Israel, obviously, because the pressure for the Israelis is constantly to demographically match the local Palestinian population, which also tends to grow faster than the rate of the Israelis. Hence, you have the law of return to encourage Jewish people from all over the world to migrate to Israel, so that this demographic imbalance will be redressed with the larger Jewish population. All right, so let me go back now to the poem by Yehuda Amichai and just say a few brief comments. Amichai was a German Jewish man who his family fled Israel during the Shoah, and he came to Israel when he was quite young. He was a German, and his German name was Ludwig Pfeiffer, I believe, Ludwig Pfeiffer. And you see this in the first lines of the poem. He says, "We forget where we came from. Our Jewish names from the exile give us away." And so to address that problem, Mr. Pfeiffer changed his name to Yehuda Amichai. And so it's the assumption of a new name, and the project of Zionism also involved Jewish nationalism in Palestine, involved a massive project of renaming the land and renaming even oneself, and again willing an entirely new language into being, modern Hebrew, and he was very much a part of that project. But there's a lot more we could say about this, but I just want to underscore that he's a European Jewish person Ashkenazi descent, German Jewish person. And the perception of Palestinians like Darwish, of course, is that this is not a matter of a return from a 2,000-year exile, as he's suggesting here, but a matter of settler colonialism. But from the perspective of this Hebrew language poet, who is an Israeli Jew, this is not a matter of settler colonialism, but it's a matter of a return to a land that one was exiled from since the time of the Roman destruction of Herod's temple in the 1st century. So 2,000-year diaspora, 2,000-year exile, which from this perspective concluded with the formation of the modern state of Israel and the aftermath of the Shoah or Holocaust, during which many Jewish people like Amichai migrated to Israel and began to participate in the project of building a Jewish state on Palestinian Arab lands. Now, okay, so I have to go quickly here, so I'm going to just cut down to the last line here. And let me note here, he states that much of the poem, the next 3 stanzas are stated, as questions. He's asking questions, much like Darwish. But Amichai was remember the Zionist movement at this time emanating from Europe was essentially a socialist movement. And he was influenced by the socialist aesthetics of the Cold War. And so his poetry is a praxis-oriented poetry. It's a poetry that asserts a thesis. So ostensibly, he's asking a question, but there are 2 different points in the poem where he actually asserts a thesis. Here, when he says, circumcision does it to us, as in the Bible story of Shechem and the sons of Jacob, so that we go on hurting all our lives. So there's the reference to the most important Jewish religious ritual, which is circumcision at birth. But then he's referring, it's strange that he doesn't refer, or it's notable anyway, that he doesn't refer to the Abrahamic covenant, but the story of its violation and the story of Shechem and the sons of Jacob, in which the vows of Jacob's sons were broken to the Shechemites, or when they were slaughtered after they agreed willingly to undergo circumcision. I want to note, as Freud said, if circumcision was an invention to distinguish Jews from other people in the region, Freud calls it a particularly clumsy invention, because it's practiced by everyone in the area, and it's practiced widely in Middle East, North Africa. It's only in the Christian context where circumcision assumes an exceptional character. But here there's an assertion that it's not, like as in what someone like Edward Said would call a secular wound or a secular trauma, which is to say all of us have been traumatized in some way, and we all share an experience of trauma. This is a different concept of the trauma of circumcision, because it's asserting a particularity the particularity of Jewish circumcision. Okay, and so when we get to the last stanza, then, which is really essentially reiterates what we just read about circumcision, Amichai says, "Spilled blood is not the root of trees, but it's the closest thing to roots we have." Okay, so if we put this in terms of figures of speech, what we have, this is a simile in effect. It is which is to say, it is an explicit comparison, unlike a metaphor, which is an implicit comparison. This is a comparison that's drawing attention to itself as a comparison. And the simile here, A is like or as B, or the simile that's asserted, which is offered to us in the form of a thesis, is that the circumcision itself, the spilling of blood, also this is linked to perhaps the idea of the pogroms and the Shoah and the suffering of Jews in Europe especially during the mid-19th century. But it's also linked to the idea, and this is where I think we need to think about it, to the idea of the law of return. Because if I were to simplify this, I basically, what is being asserted here is that the idea of blood, or let's say ethnic identity, one's ethnic identity and one's circumcision or religious identity are not exactly the same as roots in the ground, as somebody who's residing in the area, but it's close enough in effect, or it's the closest thing to roots that he says that we have. And the we is not a universal human we, it's a very particular we, the we as in the Jewish people. And so again, I'm here to I always say I'm a professor and I teach Palestinian literature, I teach Israeli literature, and I always say to my students, it's not, as a professor, my job is to ask questions, not to proselytize or convert anyone to any particular perspective, but it's up to you following, let's say, that project of the Enlightenment that Kant, summarizes as in sort of think for yourself. And so I think if you're once this thesis is asserted, what you have to ask yourself is, what do you think about that? Is a claim, is what is being claimed here, are these equivalent claims, the claim of the right of return, and then the right to migrate based on the law of return. And so here is where I wanted then to briefly, we can't, this is again not a law course, we can't go into this in too much detail, but I just wanted to bring up for you this law of return itself. And you can Google this and find your own information on it. But basically, I'm going to just summarize this. And that is that one has the right to return, much like we saw in that image of the cartoon. One has the right of return, not based on where, this is the main difference, which you need to understand, not based on where one resides in that Kantian classical, Enlightenment notion of the subject, which gets built into the UN Charter and into international law. But that idea of citizenship as residency is very different, because it's not just a matter, in the case of residency, it's where your feet are on the ground. For Kant, it was, who was an empirical external philosopher and whose ethics were always other-centered in terms of our moral duties to others. The idea is that, it's a very ancient idea. We have to share the surface, of the earth. That's the basis of the right of return concept of the human subject and human rights that Darwish is claiming. This one is rather, the Israeli law of return is based on ethnicity. When one asserts Jewish identity, it's usually articulated in maternal terms of maternal descent, based on who, the orthodoxy of the person who's making the claim. But in any case, it's an ethnic identity. One would be Jewish in the same way that one is, say, French or German. And so it has an ethnic component. And then secondly, which assumes the character again of blood descent. And then secondly, or one could be Jewish as a matter of one's spiritual beliefs. Okay, now Judaism, unlike Islam and Christianity, they're all Abrahamic traditions, but Judaism is not a evangelical articulation of Abrahamic religion. It's not a conversionary. And in fact, conversion is often discouraged because of the necessity of the ethnic dimension to the claim. Okay, so that's really the difference, the basis of these competing claims. I'm showing you here, these are just some images from the wall and houses that are demolished, that were demolished on the other side of the wall. And before I take questions, I'll just show you one more image here, a couple more. This is the Dome of the Rock, the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem, built on the site of Herod's temple and formerly before that Solomon's temple, all of which only remains is the Western Wall, where people come to pray, Jewish people come to pray on a regular basis. It's a segregated place where women on one side, men on the other. But it's built on this site, which is important to all three of the Abrahamic peoples, because inside is the rock. This is the Dome of the Rock. This is the rock where, in the Judeo-Christian tradition, Abraham took his son Isaac and was going to sacrifice him until an angel stayed his hand and he was spared, and the animal was sacrificed in his place. This is also celebrated in the Islamic tradition, although this are commemorated particularly at the conclusion of Ramadan, although in the Islamic traditions often Ishmael is said to be the son whom Abraham was going to sacrifice. And also, this is the site of Muhammad's famous night journey. And I would mention in concluding, if for Palestinians and Arab peoples, no one really even refers to Jerusalem as Jerusalem. The Arabic name is Al-Quds, which means the holy. So even what one calls this place is disputed. But the reason why you need to know this place is because of its symbolic significance for the various peoples of the book. Okay, I'm going to stop there. And let me see. I hope I didn't go too quickly, but I hope that that was helpful to you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Before we open up for questions, I wanted to ask one question to kind of help frame what we're learning in today's conflict. And I was wondering if you could talk about why now the current conflict in Gaza. You know, I heard on the news this morning that this is the most deadly conflict since the original war in the 1960s. And I wonder if you could talk about the tensions that are arising and how we got to the place that we're at right now.
Okay, sure. Thank you for your question. So I think what's important to remember is that Gaza did not start, the situation in Gaza did not begin on October the 7th. What happened was that about 15 years or so ago, the United States encouraged the Palestinians to have a democratic election. This was in the aftermath of the disasters of the Iraq War. And the Palestinians held free and fair elections, and they voted for Hamas. And so then the response of the United States and Israel was then to punish Hamas, and effectively Gaza was encircled, and it's been under siege for about 15 years. I was about 2 years ago, I was asked to write an article on the situation in Gaza in 21, and at that time, about 2,500 Palestinians had very recently been killed, by the Israelis. So, and of course the Palestinians had killed, I don't know proportionally what it was, maybe 130, I think, Israelis. I can't remember exactly the number, but my point is that that the conflict didn't start on October 7th. It's been going on a very long time. The reason why I think it blew up now was because it's funny because I was in Saudi Arabia on the time when this actually happened, when this on October the 6th and 7th, and the Israelis were getting ready to sign a normalization agreement with the Saudis, so-called Abrahamic Accords, and it looked like relations were going to be normalized for Israelis, and this probably would have been a very good thing. This did not serve the interests of Iran, and there were a lot of people that did not want Israel to have normalized relations with other countries in the region, like Saudi Arabia, for instance, with whom they'd been in conflict for many years. Israel already has normalized relations with Jordan and Egypt, for instance, but those have been seriously damaged, and I think that was the goal of those who encouraged Hamas and provided them with weapons was to, like a move on a chessboard, was to prevent there being a sort of a new dynamic in the region that didn't favor Iran and Hamas and Hezbollah and the Palestinians, because the Palestinians were essentially forgotten in this if these accords had gone forward.
Thank you. I'll open it up for questions. Let me know if you can't hear it and I'll repeat it. Does anyone have a question? Yes, thank you.
This is just a minor question, but I studied Arabic briefly in undergrad, and I'm curious if Mahmud's poems are written in a particular dialect. So I know that's a pretty big question in spoken Arabic. Is it written in Jami? Is it more standard?
Did you hear that?
Yeah, I heard that. No, it's not an Ajami poem. He writes in classical. I mean, he is a very was a very highly educated figure, and his poems are in terms of the translation of them, what I generally encourage my students to do, like we'll do an exercise where we will take 3 or 4 different translations of Darwish because he's been so widely translated, and compare and contrast them and see how different translators have handled the translation of him from the Arabic to the English. And so this is an Arabic that's spoken in Palestine, spoken in Jordan, for instance, so-called Sunni Triangle, but it's also infused with, Palestinians are really very highly, educated, university educated people, and they a lot of classical references to Aeschylus and other figures in the poetry of Darwish, which is not, his poetry is not, it's not praxis driven, I would argue, in the same way that the poetry of Amichai is. It's more philosophical, existential, questioning poetry. He doesn't tend to bludgeon us over the head with the thesis. I think this poem is one of his most explicitly political poems. So too, of course, is Identity Card, but he writes poems about all kinds of wonderful subjects, and he's beloved for very good reason.
Yep. Maybe I'll ask one. I think the poems, especially coupled, are a really good illustration of how deeply held the values are to the Palestinians and the Israelis. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about how these two differing views can be reconciled. I know that, a two-state solution has been talked about for decades. And maybe it's not as probable now as it was before the start of October. If you could talk a little bit about what a two-state solution would look like before, and maybe a little bit now.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I heard that. So, good question. And for years in the United States media, and I'm giving you, this is my view. Again, I'm a professor. My job is to ask questions so that students can come to their own conclusions. But I do have a particular political perspective on this conflict, which I've been studying for many years. And I don't believe the two-state solution is a it's a non-starter, and it's, the Biden administration keeps advocating this, and it's anytime an American politician advocates the two-state solution, in my opinion, it provides evidence that they're not serious. And the reason for this is because, there could have been a two-state solution maybe, 20, 25 years ago. But the ongoing, occupation and colonization, whatever term you want to use, the spreading of people throughout this area of different and diverse peoples with different religions and so on, different ethnicities. It's not possible any longer to separate these different groups. The word intifada is, it comes from an Arabic word that it doesn't mean revolution. It means a shirking off. And that's what the intifadas were about. It was like to stop the process of collaboration with the Israelis that was going on in the West Bank. And so the idea was to shirk off, to get this off of your shoulders, for instance. And it's not, I don't think it's possible anymore. There are too many people. They all are living close. The solution is they're gonna have to learn to get along with one another, and because you can't separate them. And so if they have to get along with one another, then the question becomes, well, what is Israel going to become? Is it going to be a Jewish state with rights, democratic rights for only some of its citizens, those who are, let's say, Jewish ethnically or religiously speaking? Or is it going to become a democratic state, with the Mandela model, in which all persons have equal rights, under the law? But if that were to happen, it would cease to be a Jewish state. You could still be an Israeli state, but it would no longer be a Jewish state. And let me just give you one example. I'll try to be quick here. If you go back to what happened in Lebanon back in the 80s, in the Reagan period, when the French left Lebanon, they propped up a Christian government, Maronite government, because they liked the idea of there being, a Christian government in the region, and so they gave the Christian Lebanese 51% control of the government, which meant then the Shiite population, the Arab Shiite population, and the Arab Sunni population, did not have control over the government. That worked for a very short period of time, but then demographically, the situation shifted, and now the Christians were in the minority. A lot more, say, Shiite, for instance, than Christians. And so in that case, if you've got more Shiite than Christians, how can the Christians continue to have hegemonic control of the government if the demographics don't support it? And I think this is the problem in modern Israel today. It's the main reason why Ariel Sharon built that wall back in the early, right around 9/11, and it was not just to keep terrorists, as you like to say, out of Israel, but also because of the ongoing expansion of the settlers in the West Bank. He realized, just as a realist, that you couldn't continue with doing what they were doing. And without being demographically, it would have been a disaster for Israel if you wanted to keep Israel a Jewish state. So this and one last point: historically, Palestinians, they do tend to have more children than Israelis, and so this again leads to this encouragement of more migrants to Israel. The birthright programs, for instance, where they'll pay American teenagers and young adults to come to Israel, in order to encourage migration. Because why? Because there's this constant demographic threat that hangs over the heads of the Israelis.
I have another question prepared. So many of us, Indigenous, Jewish, or both, identify deeply with the events that are taking place, especially coming from a background where your people have a history of exile or removal. And I'm just wondering what advice you would give to students on how do you reconcile with the events happening in Gaza, and how do you deal with this?
It's a really good question. When I teach Darwish, I like to also teach Joy Harjo, who is a Muskogee poet. And I'm sure a lot of you have been following what's been going on in Muskogee Nation with the Supreme Court, reaffirming Muskogee sovereignty. But the situation of what happened in Muskogee country with the allotments, and also in other parts of the eastern part of the state, is very similar to the situation on the West Bank. And I think it's one can compare fairly the realities that are on the ground. That if you have a predominantly, let's say, Muskogee Nation is predominantly Muskogee, and yet like, for instance, in the case, my grandmother had an 80-acre, she was on the Dawes Roll, she had an 80-acre allotment, a child's allotment that was given to her on the border of Oklahoma and Arkansas. She lost that allotment, as did many, Muskogee, through grifting, and where these lands were stolen by unscrupulous white settlers and squatters. And so now you have, in eastern Oklahoma, you have this strange, mix of people who are Muskogee, but then the ancestors of those who were grifters and came in and squatted, and even in some cases took the land of people like my grandmother or great grandmother Ari Ethel Morton. And so, but it's a lot like that on the West Bank. You have now Israelis living among among Palestinians. And if I could just add one more thing, the vast majority of the Israeli population are secular. They've never even been into a synagogue. Say about 50% are people who celebrate Jewish identity as a matter of one's ethnic heritage. And then you got about, let's say, another 30% who are modern Orthodox, and then you have around maybe 20%, 25 who are Haredim, the traditional Orthodox. But then you got 5%. These are the Messianic Zionists, the Gush Imanim, the Kukas. These are the people who are going into the West Bank and establishing settlements. And it's because they're driven by a Messianic eschatology that's very similar to the eschatology of say, Hezbollah, who are Shiite, who are sort of end times Muslims. These are sort of end times Jewish people who believe that the Messiah will not return until all of this land is under Jewish hands. And so they're driven by a theology that most Israelis object to or don't accept. And yet they're the ones that are, carrying machine guns and living in these places. But it does serve the interests of those who want to continue to expand Jewish hegemony in the region. The question is how practical is that project? And this is, Israelis often debate this. Is this, should one just walk away, bring the occupation to a close, or close the settlements, or support it? But what tends to happen is people sit around and they, will drink tea and say, well, don't make me talk about the situation today. It's, I don't want to talk about it. So one decides not to decide, but then the problem just, it gets worse and worse. And so it's a lot of atrophy is behind what's going on today.
Thank you. Do we have any more questions? All right, well, we have no more questions, so we'll wrap it up. Thank you so much for being here today, Professor Wise.
All right, thank you. It was a pleasure.